process information. That's it. Can you always see those on CAT scans? Can you see the lesions in the brain that say there is in the cortex, the visual cortex, there is, or the parietal lobe, there's a hole that doesn't allow that person to have good proprioceptive input, or in the cerebellum? Not always. So we're looking sometimes at soft signs. But as I'll explain to you in a little while, children with trauma, both prenatal, like alcohol-exposed trauma, and post-trauma, do in fact have some changes in the brain that will indicate a very specific sensory processing disorder. Okay, so the tactile system in terms of discrimination and the proprioceptive system, and then the vestibular system. Now, the vestibular system is our sense of balance. It's kind of the first thing you think about, our equilibrium. And everybody has a different capacity in all sensory mechanisms. I think the vestibular system is a good example of this. It's certainly, like other systems, very developmental. But if you look at this person here on the tightrope, he has a very refined vestibular system. He has the ability to walk on that very thin rope, almost looks like a wire, and balance that and walk across a busy intersection. How many people here would even ever want to do that? Probably very few, but some say, I've actually tried it. Okay, but the vestibular system is, when you really think about it, developmentally, is one of the first systems to begin to myelinate in utero, in addition to the tactile system. And when the infant begins to walk, the vestibular system is very consciously working. The child is in a high guard position, very, very aware of their movements, and very cautious until they're able developmentally to run well. All because of the vestibular system is conditioning. It's beginning to become efficient, it's beginning to process efficiently, and it allows the child to move more effectively. Okay. All because of how the central nervous system provides, input to our limbs, to the rest of our sensory organs, how they mix together to be able to evoke a movement. Okay, so what is sensory processing? If you think about processing, in the literature, it is really defined and it's described differently. Sometimes sensory processing is called sensory regulation. Sometimes it's just called sensory modulation. And I'm working from the frame of reference that has been developed by Lucy Miller, who I'll talk a little bit about toward the end, because I just think her definitions, after all the years of working in this and going through different definitions, going through different taxonomies, classifications, it just makes sense to me. So sensory processing is being able to detect a sensory stimulus. It's that simple. If a mosquito falls on your arm, you detect that something is crawling around on you. And we'll talk about responses to that in a minute, because some people have a very different response to a mosquito or a spider crawling on you than, say, another person does. So what we're going to do is we're going to detect that. We're going to register that and say, I feel something on my arm, and you know what? I don't think I like it. Okay? We are going to then respond with either just staying calm and flicking it off, or we're going to have a different reaction. Our modulation is going to be overreactive, or we might not even feel it. Have you ever been eating with somebody and they got a crumb in their mouth and they don't know it? And you look at them and you say, if I was a really good friend, I would tell that person to wipe their mouth. And if I'm not a good friend, I'm going to say, that's okay, you can look like that the rest of the day for all I care. If you can't modulate that and detect that, that is your problem. Okay. And the response, of course, is one of either, again, back to the mosquito, to say, slap it off, and then register all that together and say, maybe I better go in because the mosquitoes are bad tonight. The key idea, the thing that I really want to talk about and really want to emphasize when we talk about, do people have a sensory processing disorder? Certainly, when I get in here today and I see these lights, the first question I ask is, are those lights going to be on all day? Because they're very, very bright. And Brett said, yeah, they will. And I said, well, okay, I think I can live with that. And I am. I'm fine with it now. But when I first saw it, I was like, oh my gosh, I detected that and I thought, how am I going to do this? But I'm modulating pretty good. Someone else could be very distracted by that and not be able to concentrate because the lights are so significantly, involved in significantly impairing their ability to modulate. So the key idea here is that I want to adapt to the sensory stimuli around me. And I want to adapt in a meaningful way. I want to adapt in a purposeful way, in an organized way. When you observe children, to ask the question, does this child have a modulation disorder? We're looking at these things here. Because you can say a child's really active, loves to play outside, really engages in the playground equipment. So then you think, well, that's pretty good. Then he probably doesn't have issues with, over-responsivity, under-responsivity, or he's a sensory seeker, and that's okay because we all seek sensation. But the question you have to ask is it meaningful? Is it purposeful? Is it organized? A child with autism who has some of the classic signs of this kind of, flapping or something like that means a lot of different things. To us, it's not purposeful, it's not meaningful, and it certainly doesn't look organized. To that individual, though, it's exactly that. It's very purposeful because he might be wanting to drown out external stimulation. Or it's very organized then because it helps them kind of calm. We don't know that until we observe and see what their behaviors are as they do that. So this is the kind of thing I want the theme to kind of run through when we talk about, does a child have some of the things we're going to be talking about? I don't really care if a child is a sensory seeker. I don't care if you're over-responsive or under-responsive as long as you have meaningful, purposeful, organized occupational performance. In an OT language, that really is occupation is everything you do. Okay? Or this, okay? How many times I was looking for this facility today. It's very easy to find, but of course, where I was staying at the Hampton, he says, it's about 3 miles down. So I didn't realize that it was really not 3 miles, it was like a half a mile from the Hampton Inn. So I'm not even, big sign, right? Fairlane, or whatever, Ford Performing Arts, I'm way into Dearborn. I'm thinking, I think I've gone the wrong way, So my response, if I was at 20 to 9, I would be doing this, like, SOB, where am I? Oh. But it was only 5 after 9, so my adaptive response, I was pretty calm about it. So I didn't really, get really too nervous and too excited. I responded appropriately. But many of us can go back to this, given a sensory stimuli, and especially multiple sensory stimuli, and have a response like this. Have you ever been looking for directions? Or you've got direction, you're looking for a place like I was this morning, and you have to turn the radio off. And what's that about? You're looking, how does the radio interfere with your ability to look? And you'd say, well, it interferes with my ability to think. Of course it does, because too much sensory stimuli will almost make you feel like you're going to shut down a little bit or not stay organized. And we all can experience that. I think we all have experienced the idea, like, turn that off, I'm trying to... or turn that off, or stop talking, I'm trying to listen to this. We all experience that. And what we have to frame this in is that we have the ability to compensate. We can identify the sensory challenge we have and find a way to support that, to support ourselves, to have a strategy to say, I just turn the radio off and I can think better and look and concentrate better. But then we put it in the perspective of a child who's 4 or 5 years old, or even a teenager that really has not developed self-strategies to be able to modulate. And that's what we're going to be talking a little bit about today, is how can we analyze what is the sensory mechanism that is most deficient, dysfunctional, and so challenged, and how can we provide supports for that? Now, sensory processing, we've already talked about this, briefly mentioned the central nervous system and its role, but all of this is driven certainly by our entire nervous system, including certainly our brain, the central and peripheral nervous system. As we touch something using our peripheral sensation, our peripheral nerves, we touch something, I say, I'm looking for the kazoo I brought because we're going to do a little activity for those lucky 25 people that came first. I can get that right out of my pocket. So my ability, again, to feel that, touch it, and recognize what it is all driven by central nervous system function, higher levels of the brain. My ability to stand here and maintain equilibrium and not slouch over here like this, that wouldn't be very comfortable for you, would it? I'd be like, God, what's up with this guy? And I'd say, I'm sorry, guys, I just really can't maintain my stability. I'm tired, okay? Just deal with it. Now, I'm not going to do that because my peripheral nervous system, my central nervous system allows me to maintain equilibrium. Now, I can't see your faces real well, But if you did start looking kind of like you were upset with me because I was maybe, I don't know, boring, or you hated my voice, then I'm going to get a visceral response to say, oh, this isn't going very well. Just that visual input is going to impact on my autonomic nervous system. And you think about the autonomic nervous system, really such an essential part of what we're talking about, because the sympathetic system, which is part of the autonomic nervous system, is our fight or flight response. And so when we think about the children that have experienced trauma, many of those children operate at the level of the amygdala, which is really that fight or flight response, and also have difficulty filtering in a lot of emotions, which is part of the hypothalamus and also the thalamus functions. So the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic and sympathetic, the sympathetic being more fight or flight, and the parasympathetic is rest and digest. So that calms us, that gives us our homeostasis, it gives us our ability to respond to sensory information and not react in a visceral way or defecate or urinate. We've all had experiences where we've been so frightened by a visual stimulus or a tactile stimulus that we've almost had an autonomic nervous response. I don't know about you, but sometimes I can be sitting in a room in my own home just concentrating. My wife will walk in and just say something to me and I'll jump 5 feet. It just shocked me. It's almost like I almost wet my pants. Now I know you're thinking now, like, this guy's really, no wonder he's in this. He can understand us so well. But I know that you've all been frightened by somebody who's jolted you or shouted at you and you weren't expecting it, and your autonomic nervous system really kicks in. But you recover. And part of all what we're talking about too is your ability to habituate. You can have this response, you can have this extreme sensory stimulus come at you, but most of you, maybe not all of you, your central nervous system, your autonomic nervous system is functioning well enough that you can make an adaptive response and modulate and habituate and come back down. We have to remember that children who have experienced trauma do in fact have changes in their central nervous system as a result, particularly of chronic trauma. The evidence is there, the research is there to support that there are changes in brain function that would support the idea that these children do in fact have central nervous system and autonomic nervous system processing inefficiencies, to say at the very best, when some children actually have significant dysfunction and in some cases even changes in brain architecture, which we'll talk a little bit about some of that evidence. So let's get back to sensory processing, look at the classification. Now, I should have said, because I do this to my students all the time, it just really upsets them sometimes, is that I don't change my slides, I add them. So just bear with me. You'll notice that, where's this slide that he's talking about here? It's only because yesterday I thought, oh shoot, I should put that in there, and Tiffany Martinez already got my slides 2 weeks ago. So bear with me. If you really like what you see, and you say, I really want that current copy, I'm going to give you a website you can go to actually pull off the PowerPoint we're talking about today. Is that fair enough? Oh, thank you. Okay. So sensory processing. We've been describing sensory modulation, sensory-based motor, and sensory discrimination. Those are the 3 areas that basically make up sensory processing. So we're going to call it sensory processing as opposed to sensory integration. Sensory integration is a theory. Sensory integration is a theory. Sensory processing disorder is the diagnosis. And occupational therapy using a sensory integration approach is the treatment. Oh, how parochial is that? It's OTSI, not MSWSI, but it could be if you decide to become trained. No one says that a nurse, a social worker, a physician, a physical therapist, or a speech pathologist cannot use a sensory integration intervention approach. And I think after I came here today and they said there were 300 people pre-registered. And of course, the first thing is I'm terrified, because what if it isn't what everybody wants? And I kept telling people, but what if, you got 300 people, what if, not every one of those 300 people like what I do? And they look at me and say, well, how can that happen? Okay. So anyway, what we're going to get next is more specific information about this. Sensory processing disorder. We're going to talk about sensory modulation disorder, and we're really going to emphasize that whole piece today. But let me just go through the matrix. With sensory modulation disorder, we're talking about 3 different types of